All right, there we go. Welcome, everybody. We are excited on behalf of the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns to have our friends from Accenture here today to share some of their wisdom about CARES Act funding, IIJA funding, and kind of figuring out how to maneuver all of that and use it to its best strategies while reducing risk. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kelly Rogers, who will kick it off and introduce her other colleagues too. Thanks, Kelly.
Great. Thank you, Jen. So nice to be with this group today. Good morning, and I'm really excited for the conversation that we're about to have. My name is Kelly Rogers. I am a strategy and consultant professional with Accenture, and I'm joined by two colleagues who will introduce themselves in a moment, Bill Kilmartin and Katie Birdie. I'm seeing on the Zoom screen here some familiar names. Feel free to put your camera on if you'd like to allow us to see your face, but no pressure whatsoever. Some of you may know, prior to my role at Accenture, I served in state government in Rhode Island, where I worked with many of you and your colleagues on behalf of the General Treasurer, Seth Magaziner, serving in a public finance leadership capacity. So you may remember several data requests from me related to debt and local pension fiscal health, subject that has historically been very important and continues to be very important to all of us on this call. It's an interesting, before I turn it over to Bill and Katie to introduce themselves, it's an interesting time to be having a conversation about public finance, whether we're in Rhode Island or any state. It feels like just a few years ago, back when I was in Treasury, the conversation was always about kind of austerity and how we promote fiscal health in light of constrained resources. And now we're in a position where resources are abundant, and we certainly want to be mindful and promote, strong and robust stewardship of federal funds. But we're in a much different position, as you know, than we've been historically. And I think there was news just the other day about Rhode Island's state surplus being at historic levels as well. So part of what we're hoping to do today is to share a little bit about the work that we've been doing with public sector clients like you across the United States to help first understand the opportunity that's been presented by federal funding that has come to states and cities and counties since COVID hit in May of 2020 or March of 2020. So we'll kind of present an overview of our understanding of the landscape of new funding. Then we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about how we think about approaching the funding. So things that could be done and that we've seen done, leading practices around designing, optimizing the funds in a way that is ultimately reducing risk, your risk profile as a recipient of funds. We'll tell you a little bit about us and what we do outside of federal funding, and then hoping to have a discussion with you about what you're viewing as challenges, opportunities. We would like to better understand your unique position as a leader of this administration, of funding administration in Rhode Island. So with that, let me turn it over to, let's do Katie first, and then Bill, you can round out the intros, and then we'll get started.
Hi, good morning. My name's Katie Birdie. I'm a consultant in our strategy and consulting practice, specifically focused on public sector clients based out of Boston. And for the last year and change, I've been helping a state government with managing their federal funds in a project management capacity and understanding all of the funding that is coming through, how it's able to be spent, and helping them plan how they're going to spend it in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Katie. I guess it's over to me. Good morning, folks. This is Bill. As you see on the screen, I'm associated with what we call the Government Senior Advisor Program. I had worked for Accenture for 20 years. My job was the industry lead for public sector finance and administration. Prior to that, I worked in state government for 25 years, serving 10 years as the state controller of Massachusetts. So this Government Senior Advisor Program is, I work part-time, supporting various Accenture teams on particular initiatives across the country. When it comes to the federal funds, I support the Accenture's work helping the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the state of New York, and the Commonwealth of Virginia on managing the federal funds. And to build off a point, Katie, that you mentioned, so I've been doing this for a long time, and you know, there's always been this notion of federal grants coming to states and municipalities. But what's different here is what I refer to as like tidal waves of federal funding. If you think of the CARES Act itself, a ton of money flowing from the feds down to state and local governments. On the heels of the CARES Act, there was the American Rescue Plan Act, nicknamed ARPA, another tidal wave of federal funding coming down. And then, you know, behind that, the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, yet a third tidal wave of federal funding. So it really is different in the volume of the money that's available, and all of the compliance and other issues that are associated with this. That's sort of create a unique situation, and I'm happy to support the teams in the governments helping to absorb, digest, and manage this money effectively. So Kelly, I'm back to you.
Great. And just before we kick it off, just a couple norms for the conversation. Please feel free to interrupt us, you know, come off mute, send a chat ping. Like, we want this to be engaging and back and forth. So please don't hesitate to interject. And when you do, let us know your name, but also what city you're from. I know some of you and your associated cities, but I would love to hear from those whom I've not met yet. So with that, as I indicated, we are going to, hold on one second. First, talk about the funds and the tidal waves, as has been referenced. Approach considerations. We'll talk a little bit about Accenture, and then we'll have a discussion. So Katie, I think you're going to kick us off with an overview of the tidal waves.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I'm going to provide some background on the landscape of federal funds. And as Kelly mentioned, please feel free to interject with questions. It can be kind of confusing and a lot of numbers, so feel free to ask questions. So as Bill mentioned, there's been several tidal waves of funding, and state and local governments have received an unprecedented amount of money since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of the largest packages that were passed were the $1.7 trillion CARES Act that was passed by President Trump in March of 2020. And then a year later, President Biden passed the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan Act, known as ARPA. And then in November of 2021, the Biden administration passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which totals $1.2 trillion. And on the slide, we have Build Back Better. Seems like conversations are a little bit stalled on that one, but there is potential for additional infrastructure money to flow to state and local governments. You can go to the next slide. So as you can see here, IIJA includes roughly $550 billion in net new spending, in addition to $450 billion of already authorized funds. And some of the largest buckets within the new funding are $270 billion for transportation, which includes investment in things like roads and bridges, rail, public transit, airports, ports, EV infrastructure, and electric buses and bus facilities. And then there is $185 billion for utilities, which includes things like the power grid, high-speed internet, and clean drinking water. $71 billion for environmental initiatives, including climate and cyber resiliency and pollution remediation. And then there's $25 billion for other infrastructure initiatives. So as you can tell, IIJA leaves a lot of money for states, but substantive action is required by states who plan to take advantage of certain funding programs. As you can see, there's several programs within broadband that states are eligible for, including the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant Program, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, and Middle Mile Infrastructure. And the Biden administration is referring to this as the Internet for All initiative. Just last week, some more information about how states can apply for these grants and what's required of them was released. And Accenture is doing a lot of research and trying to understand how we can help states and local governments and what is required of them. And there is $1 billion for investment in cybersecurity. So states can provide a cybersecurity plan in order to certify that funding is needed. And then there's $10 billion for transportation grant programs, including the National Infrastructure Project Assistance, local and regional project assistance, and the SMART program. And then there is a lot of money for transit, including buses and bus facilities, transit-oriented development planning, and grant programs for enhanced mobility for seniors and individuals with disabilities. So a lot of these programs require states to provide a plan to the federal government. And additionally, there is a lot of money available for states to take advantage of for investment in energy, including energy infrastructure, the Energy Infrastructure Federal Assistance Program, state energy conservation plans, some programs about battery and battery materials, as well as electric vehicle infrastructure and charging.
Just to emphasize one point before we move on, this is just IIJA opportunity that we're referencing here. You know, that last or second to last bar in the chart, the subsequent or the previous packages that were passed also had infrastructure related funding opportunities too, as we'll cover in a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. So we have identified a few myths about IIJA. So the first one, it's a common misconception that the bill is just for concrete, steel, and asphalt, but it actually includes funds for physical infrastructure modernization, along with tech investment needed to plan, design, build, operate, and maintain it. And the IIJA really challenges us to think differently about what is infrastructure, as it is not just the traditional roads and bridges projects. The next one is kind of similar to what I just said, but the bill is traditional highway spending and BAU investment, but it actually includes historic investments in several categories of infrastructure, including roads, bridges, broadband, water, ports, the grid, rail, and transit. Next, it's a common misconception that a lot of the funds will be made available through competitive grants, but actually 60% of the IIJA funds will be direct funding to states based on predetermined formulas and metrics. And then 40% of the funds are available through competitive grants. And over the past few months and continuing on for the foreseeable future, there continues to be more information about the competitive grants that states are eligible for, along with timelines about when the applications will be released. And then lastly, the fourth myth is that IIJA funding will take several years to get allocated to US states. But actually it will begin to be allocated over 5 years with projects spanning over 10. And a lot of the funding, or a significant part of the funding, is already available. And as I just said, a lot of the programs are open for states to apply for the grants. And then, as we mentioned, the American Rescue Plan provided significant funding to state and local governments. And that was through the establishment of the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, which was a big chunk of the total package of the American Rescue Plan Act. So the SLFRF appropriates funds directly to cities, counties, and tribes and territories, as well as the Capital Projects Fund, which allows states to apply for additional funding for investment in capital projects. So the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund was established to help state and local governments fight the COVID-19 pandemic, address the economic fallout from the pandemic, and lay the foundation for an equitable recovery. And some of the key objectives of the SLFRF include directly supporting COVID-19 response efforts to continue to decrease the spread of the pandemic and to bring the pandemic under control. Additionally, to support immediate economic stabilization for households and businesses, given the effects that the pandemic had on the economy. The SLFRF also allows state and local governments to use funding to replace lost revenue and to strengthen support for vital public services and help retain jobs, given a lot of revenue was lost during the pandemic, and significant proportions of staff were lost as well. And then lastly, another objective is to help address systemic public health and economic challenges that have contributed to the inequitable impact of the pandemic. As I'm sure you all know, and it's been proven over the last few months, that the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately impacted certain populations. So one of the goals of ARPA is to invest in these communities and ensure that we have an equitable recovery moving forward. So in May of 2021, the US Treasury released extensive guidance that outlines how ARPA funds are able to be used and how the fiscal recovery funds can be used by state and local governments. And they outlined 5 key allowable uses for the funds. The first is addressing the public health emergency through COVID-19 mitigation initiatives like vaccine campaigns and distribution of vaccines, medical care and testing and contact tracing, as well as enhancement and investment in public health data systems, addressing health disparities, and specific interventions to address the increased violence that was experienced during the pandemic. Additionally, ARPA and FRF specifically, state and local governments can use the money to mitigate the negative economic impacts that the pandemic caused, including providing assistance to workers and industries that were negatively impacted by the pandemic, including cash assistance and job training for individuals and assistance to small businesses. It also allows for assistance to impacted households, including aid for reemployment, job training, food, rent, and mortgages. It allows state and local governments to address homelessness and education disparities and to rehire public sector workforce that might have been lost during the pandemic. It also allows for governments to provide premium pay, which is essentially bonus payments for essential workers. And it also allows for funds to be used to replace lost revenue as a result of the pandemic, and to make investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure, both existing infrastructure for water and sewer, cybersecurity for water and sewer infrastructure, and expanding broadband access with a focus on underserved communities and last mile connections, which goes back to the goal of the funds, which is to provide an equitable recovery. And I will now turn it back over to Kelly.
Thank you so much, Katie. Just pausing for a moment before we continue with the slides. What strikes me, not just today, but over the past 2 years has been obviously the magnitude of funds. So Bill referenced the tidal waves earlier, but the complexity of them. So Katie just showed us, some eligible uses of IIJA and ARPA, but as you know, before that, there was the CARES Act and other bills, and they each kind of have their own prescriptions for how funds can be used. And it's a huge game of Tetris, essentially, to like fit all the pieces together in a way that's that you can operate. So that's something that we've been really focused on, is understanding the nuances of allowable uses and helping clients with that optimization and frankly compliance, which Bill will talk a little bit about later. So now that we've talked about like the universe of what's available, I want to take a step back and think about, what can governments do as they think about crafting a strategy around the funds. And so this slide is really intended to walk through how you might think about deploying funds. So everywhere from what's on the left, which is that, you can kind of do a quick fix, address budget gaps, address things like deferred maintenance, which has the advantage of kind of addressing immediate relief, but also doesn't really hit at some of the longer term, more sustainable needs that might be intended by the bills. And then as you shift towards the right, like with the ultimate goal over on the right being generational transformation. So really using these funds to focus on strategic priorities, strategic improvements across or within government, which has the advantage of being sustainable over the long term, but really requires some transparency around what you're doing and why, so that the public understands the intended kind of goal of how you're spending the money. And then there's like everything in between, right? There's the idea that you can partner with external groups or private sector entities to develop matching schemes. You can kind of take a distributive approach where like everyone's happy and you're emphasizing the role of fairness, but perhaps diluting the ability to make an impact with the funds. So we've seen everything across this spectrum, and it really depends on the client and your unique position and objectives, where you want to sit on this continuum. But the underlying message here is that you have the choice. You can design this in a way that meets whatever objective you desire. And the other thing that we've seen as we've worked with states and cities is that, and I know there's a lot of text here, so we'll make sure you have these slides. You don't need to strain your eyes now, but the goal of this slide is to demonstrate that you're not in this alone. We can learn from each other, and there are some groups out there, including Accenture, but other kind of thought leadership groups that are really like daily tracking what's coming out of states and cities around the use of funds. So this slide reflects our understanding of how states have reported using fiscal recovery funds for infrastructure investment. So you may know that the fiscal recovery funds have a kind of like a performance report requirement, and this slide reflects what we learned from the last performance reports that were submitted to the federal government, and it's our synthesis of that. Just one example of how we can learn from each other on uses of funds across government entities, because it's likely that if you're wondering, should I use local fiscal recovery funds for broadband, it's likely that someone else has tackled that challenge, and there's an ability to find out who else is doing what you're doing as well. Okay, so continuing with this theme of how you could approach fund administration. We think of it as there's a range of needs. So there is the need to manage the scale and scope of the funds, which kind of goes to the point I raised a few minutes ago. This isn't just overwhelming because of how much money is on the table. It's because kind of the broad scope that is covered by what you can use the funds for. It's also not lost on us that capacity of governments to do this well is often limited. So as finance directors, you often have a lot on your plate already, let alone billions of dollars or millions of dollars of federal stimulus funding. There is a need across the board for governments to think about, not just in the immediate term, like how they're managing these funds, but how are you going to continue to do so in a way that's sustainable over the life of the funding cycle. So some of these funds go out 5 years plus, and making sure that there's consistency as you think about reporting and optimizing and compliance, into the future. So that's what we mean by capacity. Also, what's striking is that there's just a lot of players at the table. So there are states spending funds, cities spending funds. There's other subrecipients that have received funds. So for instance, healthcare systems and associated nonprofits is one example. Businesses are another example. In some cases, these are direct allocations from the federal government. In other cases, they're subrecipients of other pass-through entities. There's just a lot of people to coordinate and stakeholders to coordinate. And so there's a need to think about that strategy holistically and making sure that you're working together to optimize funding. And then kind of heading towards the right of the slide, compliance is a never-ending pursuit with respect to these funds. And Bill's going to talk about that in a moment. It's something that Katie, Bill, and I have worked together on with respect to a major budget office in New England. Kind of designing the compliance function for these funds is relatively new in terms of like the amount of work on the table. So it's not new to have a compliance function for federal funds, but just the overall magnitude and scope of what's needed is it merits attention, let's just say. Then there's actually like program execution. So once you design programs to fund, making sure that they're doing well and that they're drawing down funds and reporting as needed. And then just lastly, thinking about how do you tell the story? So what are the outcomes that, 10 years from now, when the public is asking, where did all that money go, right? Like, how do you make sure that along the way, you're in a position to keep track of outcomes? So these are some of the things that we think about as we think about the whole kind of scope of work that is involved here. The other thing that comes to mind is because of the kind of the unique goals of each of the federal bills that Katie walked us through, there's a set of objectives that have been articulated for spending funds. So we've talked a little bit about equity or social equity, but the idea that the funds are being used to allow everyday citizens to participate in the economy equally, or to use the funds to spur economic development in underserved communities. So that's one articulated goal that we've seen in these bills. Second would be sustainability and resiliency. So how do you reach kind of low carbon economies over the short to long term, promote sustainability, fortify infrastructure, and not just against weather events, but other threats like cyber. And now more than ever, kind of the need to think about supply chain issues as part of that bucket is increasingly important. I'm a new mom, a relatively new mom, and the baby formula shortage hits me pretty hard here in my home in Providence. And so Supply chain is an issue that I've paid more attention to than ever over the past couple of weeks. So thinking about things like supply chain is important. Made in America is another one that has been expressed and articulated, does create some challenges from a cost perspective, but important to consider. And then lastly, because of the effects that COVID had on the workforce, making sure that kind of workforce development and job creation remains a central focus of use of funds. This is similar to that first slide I went over a few moments ago, but it's a little different in that it intends to show like that continuum that I talked about. It really reflects different levels of maturity, you could say. So I wanted to include this as well, but also it allows us to think about the core limitations. So to get to the highest level of maturity, far on the right of the screen, you really need commitment, and you need a strategy that's well defined and transparent to stakeholders. And that kind of speaks to a theme that we've seen, across the board. There's a tendency to want to just dig right in and like get going, spending the money, like let's get it out the door. People need the funds. But we encourage, as much to the extent possible, we try to encourage upfront strategic planning, especially with IIJA. The best example one of our colleagues frequently uses is with IIJA, there's going to be a tremendous amount of like digging in the ground, right? Whether it's for transportation or broadband or, the need to coordinate those holes in the ground, for instance. And I'm just using an example, like a pretty rough example, but so that if you're going to dig in Cranston for a new bridge, right? Like, shouldn't you also know if Cranston needs, I don't know, a new water pipeline at the same time, and that level of coordination, and that's a really rough example, but I think you get the point. Like, there's just a whole new layer of complexity around coordinating planning with fund execution. Okay. Shifting gears, I'm just going to tee up the compliance subject. Bill is really our expert as a former comptroller of Massachusetts on compliance. But the way that we've talked about compliance with our clients is there's really three prongs to a successful strategy. The first is an inventory, which I'll talk about in a moment. Second are systems and data. And then the third are policies and procedures. So with respect to the inventory, one of the first things we did after the CARES Act was passed that has kind of helped across the board all the way through to IIJA has been creating a centralized source of truth of the funds that have come in. So whether it's, the town of Bristol or the state of Texas, like, you need to understand what money you've received and how and what the variables are of that funding. So for instance, where is the money going? Like, which agency, right? Is it a new program or does it go to an existing program? What are the key reporting requirement dates? Are there any guidance links available in federal government websites? Kind of tracking that all in one place so that as you work with your departments or the state, you can talk about this shared understanding of the funds. And I'm sure many of you have done this already, but we view this as the critical first step, is to just align with others on the opportunity set. We use the federal funds information for states as a key source for this, but that's not the only source. And in fact, Katie is an expert in this more than most, but there are a lot of ways you can pull together information about these funding sets, including secondary sources and having a regular cadence of checking, like pulling information from multiple websites is one example. So shifting gears, the second prong are systems. So the goal here is, it's sometimes not necessary to create a whole new system, right? But the idea behind this is how can you best leverage the existing systems you have in place? So that might be the case of a kind of formal modern ERP system in some cases. In others, you might be tracking your financials in Excel. And I know there's a huge range there in between, but thinking about what tags you need to tie into that system and kind of have a consistent tracking system, recording payments, documenting what's obligated and amounts paid, tracking time spent on funds, thinking about how you display expenditure of funds to the public. And then ultimately, as Bill's going to talk about, using this information for subrecipient monitoring, which is a core activity of compliance. And then, in addition to the inventory and systems, we also think about leveraging relevant policies or procedures. So a big one is internal control plans and documents that exist already, or potentially the need for new ones. Understanding public procurement rules and what needs to be followed for deploying funds, retention of contracts and documents, like what is the kind of holding period you have for things like receipts. Any guidance that might exist at the state level or frankly at the federal level for monitoring your subrecipients. Making sure you understand kind of the full landscape of compliance requirements, which Bill's going to talk about in a moment, including from kind of obscure provisions like the Cash Management Investment Act, and then any practices you have to monitor what's going on within your agency in terms of monitoring performance against policy. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Bill now, who's going to walk us through some of the key highlights of a compliance framework and lessons learned.
Thanks, Kelly. As public sector finance professionals, there's like two #1 priorities. Because on the one hand, there's the priority to maximize obtaining and then deploying the federal funds in an efficient and effective way. So you want to maximize the federal money. But an equal priority one is to execute those funds in a manner that complies with all the federal requirements. So I don't see this as like one versus the other. These are like two #1 priorities. And you see that represented here in the top of the slide about maximizing the use of federal funds and minimizing the risk. Because if the government falls short on the compliance, there are consequences, not least of which is you have to give back the federal money, which then of course begs the question, where do you get the money to give back if you've already spent it? Plus, there are other consequences about perceptions of public perceptions on negative audit findings and things of that nature. So there's a variety of activities that one might consider, and I'll talk a bit about those on the right-hand part of this slide. And you might say to yourself, what should I do as a finance professional? And how should I think about how I fit into this part of the overall scheme of things? And so one thing is you could become a subject matter expert and read the regulations and the federal guidance, which we'll talk about in more detail in some slides that are coming, and become like the go-to person. So when people in your government have questions, who are they going to call? And it's nice that they would have a point of contact who either knows the answer or knows where to go hunting and find the answer. There's also this notion of the federal reporting, very detailed reporting requirements. the strings attached to all these tranches of federal funding. And so it would make sense to have that somebody in charge, overall cognizance of the reporting functions, to be able to pull together and then represent on behalf of the government a single point of contact as it relates to the federal reporting. Reviewing the pattern of expenditures is another thing that you might consider doing, is from time to time, looking at individual expenditures and pressure testing them. Are these expenditures for an allowable use and an allowable cost? To the extent you're using subrecipients, and many governments are using subrecipients, a topic again that I'll expand upon in a few slides to follow. There's this whole notion of when the government gets the money and then passes the money on to another entity, a so-called subrecipient, the government doesn't forego its responsibility. It retains all the obligations of performance of the subrecipient. And so just when you give the money to a subrecipient, it doesn't mean that the government is done. It means that the government continues to be responsible for the performance of that subrecipient and all the compliance requirements, except in reporting requirements, et cetera, et cetera. So, making sure that the subrecipients that the government is using are indeed trustworthy in conducting risk assessments, things of that nature. And developing a compliance plan, especially putting together a federal compliance plan with your pre-existing internal control plans and policies is something to think about. Strategic support, change management, communications, and of course, just project management type skills. So these are all activities that a finance professional might consider as they tackle the opportunity and the challenge in front of us. I'll go to the next slide. So you might ask yourself, where do I fit on this spectrum of concern? If you are extremely familiar with managing federal money and you've done it a lot, you've got a lot of experience, then you might say you are in a relatively low risk situation. If you can quote chapter and verse, the federal guidance, 2 CFR, Part 200, Subpart F, single audit requirements. If you know this stuff off the top of your head, you might say, hey, I got it. I've been doing this a lot. In contrast, on the extreme other end, if you're receiving big amounts of federal money for the first time, it's all new to you. And you might have the best of intentions, but still there is the risk of making mistakes, inadvertent mistakes. But a mistake, whether it's inadvertent or not, is still in the eyes of the federal government a compliance finding that has compliance consequences. And then of course you might find yourself. So the point of this slide is you can sort of calibrate the nature of your approach based on your perception of where you fit on this spectrum. And if you need to bring on more resources, hire more people, or certified public accounting firms or other types of assistance, if you feel that that's warranted, that is an allowable use of the federal money. And so you could use some of the federal money to beef up your capacity based on how much capacity you think you might need. Let's look at this example. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this one. This is an example of just the American Rescue Plan Act, the ARPA, and the component of that, the State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, the FRF. This sure is a lot of acronyms in this. And this is the tranche of money where some money came directly to all the states. Then money went directly to counties. And also money went directly to what's called metropolitan cities of a certain size. And then a bunch of money went to what was nicknamed non-entitlement units, which is literally every municipality, every city and town in the United States of America. So everybody got money under this FRF. Depending on your status, if you're a state, you get a certain amount, a county, a certain amount, a metropolitan city, a certain amount, or everybody else, the so-called non-entitlement units, the smaller cities and towns, again, you get a certain amount. So it is the most expansive and also, by the way, the most flexible of all those waves of federal funding, but itself comes with a bunch of requirements, strings attached. So we're going to dive into that a little bit. And really my purpose on this slide is to communicate how, what's the saying? The hip bone's connected to the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone. Well, what happens is all these pockets of federal guidance refer to each other. And so it's really the universe of guidance is like a web of guidance. And you don't necessarily have to become expert in every aspect of the web, but it is worthwhile to become cognizant of how these things relate to each other. And when necessary, be able to call upon experts to do the deep dive on the individual details. So in the case of the FRF, you have on the left there, the American Rescue Plan Act, the ARPA, the law authorizing the state local fiscal recovery fund. So there's the law itself. And if you want, you can, we have links and you can read the law and see what it says. It's, by the way, it's dozens and dozens and dozens of pages. But there's the law. Well, the law said that the US Treasury Department needs to issue a regulation. So the Treasury Department issued a regulation called 31 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 35. So you can read that, which is the specific regulations implementing the ARPA law. And for those of you that get into this stuff, that is also 60, 70 pages of material. This 31 CFR Part 35, the Treasury regulation, incorporates by reference the what's often referred to as the uniform guidance for all federal grants, because the Fiscal Recovery Fund is a federal grant. So that's the omnibus regulation for all federal grants, including the ARPA, known as 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance. It also incorporates by reference regulations of other federal agencies, such as the Department of Labor in the for non-discrimination and the System for Award Management, so-called SAM system. And then, by the way, you see represented on next to the uniform guidance, Appendix 11 Compliance Supplement. So that's detailed guidance for auditors about how to audit all federal programs. So here you have represented on the page, an example of the universe of federal guidance as it relates to just the fiscal recovery program. You should become at least familiar with all the sources of federal guidance, and to the degree necessary, more proficient or even expert on the contents of these items of federal guidance. But as they say in the infomercial, but wait, there's more. You want to go to the next slide? In addition to all those authoritative regulations that we just described, they also incorporate by reference additional informational or operational types of guidance. Again, I'm just using the FRF as a single example. You can go to the Treasury website and you can see all the individual items and which are represented in this slide here, but there's a specific techniques for the grant application terms and conditions. That's that System of Award Management, the SAM, where governments need to register and get a SAM ID number in order to draw down funds and to then interact with the federal government. There's a variety of executive orders and memos from the White House. There's just narratives on frequently asked questions. There's specific guidance on how to do evidence-based program evaluation and reporting. There's various memorandums on non-discrimination and how to think about reaching out to disproportionately impacted populations and so forth. So the point here is there is a complicated universe of guidance in which one needs to operate. Why don't we continue to the next slide? It's not surprising, given the magnitude of the money, that a typical practice for governments is to take the grant and then turn around and make a sub-grant and pass the money on to a sub-recipient. And so what we find is that typically anywhere from like 30 to 50% of the federal funds that a government is getting, it in turn is then turning around and then sub-granting to sub-recipients. This puts a premium on the whole notion of how do I identify sub-recipients? How do I engage with sub-recipients? How do I determine which sub-recipients are going to get the pass-through funding? Is it going to be competitive? Is it going to be selected on some other basis? And then what are my remaining obligations for monitoring the performance of the sub-recipients? One of the reasons that I tend to harp on this issue, and I see Kelly and Katie laughing in the background because they've heard me say this before, is when you get to audit findings, it is inevitable that the federal government will come in and will be auditing you. When you get audit the number one audit finding, having read all these federal audit reports, is insufficient subrecipient monitoring. It is the most common type of audit finding. And if you're going to put a lot of your money through the subrecipient channel, the risk is that typical audit finding might become magnified in this consequence. Why don't we go to the next slide? So there's this question of how do I know the difference between a contractor and a subrecipient? Referring back to the federal guidance that we talked about before, is this specific criteria about that the feds say apply these criteria to make a decision whether you're engaging a contractor, in which case you're just writing a contract, and then holding the contractor accountable for the performance of that contract, versus a subrecipient whom you're passing on the federal funds, but then the obligations for compliance continue to be attached and flow down to that subrecipient. So you apply the federal criteria to determine if you're a contractor versus a subrecipient, and then you deal with them appropriately. Just to comment on this for a little bit before we move on. Subrecipients would be making, so what are the examples of the criteria that a government needs to consider making the decision if it's a subrecipient versus a contractor? If the entity is going to make eligibility decisions, that's one of the criteria that it's a subrecipient. So the government can make an eligibility determination of who's eligible for this program. They could engage a subrecipient who could, on their behalf, make decisions about who's eligible. So the ability to make eligibility determinations is one of the criteria of a subrecipient versus a contractor. If the entity is in the business of delivering a certain good or service, and does that generally speaking to everybody, not just the governments, that's usually a contractor versus a subrecipient. And just examples of the type of criteria. If you wanted to, we could come back and cycle back on that. I think, Kelly, you and I published a blog on this topic on the Accenture.com webpage a couple of weeks ago. Okay, one on the next slide. And so if you are engaged in subrecipients, which is highly likely, you should also think about how you're going to monitor the subrecipient performance. The point here is, once you pass the money along to the subrecipient, your obligations are not over. You have this ongoing obligation to do monitoring of the subrecipient. And typically monitoring might take the form of a desk review. So or another example might be a site review. And so these are what you see represented on this slide is some advice about how to set up a desk review process. So if you're passing, when you're passing money on to a subrecipient, and now you're into the monitoring could be a desk review, which is from time to time, I want to review perhaps a subset of activity and expenditures by my subrecipient, and therefore keep my finger on the pulse of how they're doing. And typically this would be done, more than once a year, as an example of subrecipient monitoring. Desk review is one way. On-site, visit would be another example of subrecipient monitoring. I'll go to the next slide. Okay, so we could spend more time on compliance, and if you want, to dig into some more of the details. But the point is, maximize the federal funds on the one hand, but also do it in a manner that is compliant to your citizens and to the federal government. On the other hand, they are equivalent priorities. And now I'm going to pass it back to Kelly.
Thanks, Bill. And I think one example that really illustrates the work that's involved with the kind of second tier that Bill just outlined, the compliance framework. When we started in the budget office of a state in New England in May of 2020, there was no one doing federal fund compliance on the state side. Now, and Katie, I'm going to need your help with this, but they've built out a team, in addition to working with us, of I think 3 or 4 compliance specific staff members that just do this. Is that right, Katie?
Yeah, there's 4 staff who are responsible, as well as compliance officers within each agency that's receiving FRF funding,
Right.
which was, with Bill's help, we provided that recommendation.
Right. So kind of goes to the earlier point about the need for capacity and just getting ahead of that potential audit finding that Bill referenced about subrecipient monitoring.
And one of the ironies, perhaps, Kelly, is these additional staff and the expenses for that additional staff are being funded by the federal grants that they're overseeing.
Right. So we definitely want to hear from you, but I just want to take a moment and just tell you a little bit about Accenture so that you understand the type of work we're doing. And we're happy to continue the conversation if any of you have more questions. But, Katie, Bill, and I sit in a part of Accenture that's called Health and Public Service. So beyond health and public service, we're a very large company. It's a professional service company. So we cover clients ranging from governments to corporations globally. We have about 700,000 people across the globe helping with a range of services, from strategy and consulting, which is what Katie, Bill, and I do, to technology implementation, to operations, which are just some of many, many functions that we do. Inside the health and public service practice, specifically the strategy and consulting practice, we help mostly state and local governments with a range of complex issues. So most recently, those have included federal funding administration as a top priority. But that's not the only type of work we do. For years, Bill helped public sector clients implement and kind of develop the strategies around large enterprise resource planning implementations. So your human capital management or your finance systems, thinking ahead to how to implement those in the best way possible, and really support the sustainability of your back office functions. That's another example, but there are many more. So since COVID hit, we've helped with services like contact tracing, administering rental relief and home ownership programs for states and cities around the country. So the way I think about it is we help governments with their most complex problems. And right now, federal fund administration is a major one, both a problem and an opportunity, right? And so just a couple ways we do that. We help with visioning, developing tools and processes with you to administer the funds, kind of overseeing end-to-end fund management. And then there's some like niche services over on the right, like, to the extent communication support is needed or policy advising, those are also within scope for us as well. Just to give you a sense of where we're doing this work, this is a little bit outdated, but we've been in approximately 14 jurisdictions since COVID hit, helping with this type of fund management from the state to county to city level, doing a range of functions. So in some of these states, we're helping with, for instance, FEMA Public Assistance Administration. In others, we're taking on more of a compliance role. So it kind of, the scope differs across the board. And then just beyond kind of fund administration during COVID, helping a lot of local governments with strategy work, visioning work, and implementation as well. And this just gives you a sample of where we operate across the US. So with that, I want to just take a moment and hear from you. So would love to hear, I think two things from my perspective. One would be any general reactions you had to what we presented today, whether it felt like the right set of problems that you're dealing with. If you have questions, that would be interesting. But then also the second piece would be, as you administer these funds in your cities, what are you dealing with that are the most pressing challenges? So what's hardest about this for you? I'd love to hear any volunteers.
Kelly, I can say that I know some folks might not have video ability.
Okay.
Usually
anyone want to share observations or some experience that you've dealt with over the past 2 years of COVID administering these funds?
Hi, Kelly, this is Laura.
Hi, Laura.
Honestly, we're so small. Our biggest issue is going to be compliance. We have our ARPA money and it's all under revenue replacement, but it's going to be the compliance side of it from a very small town. It's only a couple $1 million. But when you're talking about purchasing and environmental reviews and all those compliance issues, we're not up to speed. So for us, it is direction and compliance.
Hey, Laura, are you getting more than $750,000?
We're getting 2 million.
Yeah, so anybody that gets $750,000 or more of federal funding automatically must do a single audit.
And we already have a single audit. That's easy. That's not the hard part. The hard part is all of the what is it? CRF, whatever the regulations are. When it comes down to Davis-Bacon, environmental impact statements, and all of the small business, minority, all of those regulations. We were not up to speed. We've never had this much money before.
Yep, yep. And I was going to pass along just any finding in a single audit, it's going to automatically trigger a visit by the U.S. Treasury Office of Inspector General.
And I don't
Yeah.
want to have, I mean, I don't want to even get there. That's not,
Right.
so it's a matter of every step along the way. We have a staff person who will be our grant manager, but it's still it's a lot for one person to know. We aren't even able to apply for community development block grants because we used to have a regional grant manager, and that agency dissolved. So so that would have been like our stepping stone into these federal funds, but we don't have that that education. So it is that, and then that's just ARPA. But now that we're talking about infrastructure money that's being filtered through the state down to the municipalities, if we apply, it's a matter of, okay, what is available from the state? There's such a huge list of funding opportunities. We kind of need some guidance as to, okay, this project you're thinking of would fit here. We're not well versed on everything that's coming down the pike and where our projects might fit. Those are our issues.
And who is the, it's been about 2.5 years since I've been at the state. So help me understand, is it the Pandemic Recovery Office, a DOA, that would help you navigate that? Or is there a different branch that might help you?
Well, honestly, there is the pandemic recovery, but they've kind of done a hands-off that they can't give us guidance because that's not their role. They can't tell us what we can or can't do. But they're there if we have questions. But anybody else want to help pipe in on this one?
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry, this is Brian Rosso. I work closely with Laura Kenyon because, we're neighboring municipalities. I share a lot of the same concerns as her. And one of the immediate concerns I have is about subrecipients. And I know you guys had discussed that in this presentation and you did a great job covering that. I'm faced with some subrecipients that are coming, looking for some funds, and it's kind of an urgent matter. So I am trying to emphasize to my council, what guidance this and basically portray that same message to the subrecipient, what guidelines they're going to have to follow. Is there, and again, these are volunteer employees, the subrecipient, and our town council who have, no finance background. So I'm trying to, for lack of better words, dumb it down and try to just bullet point some of the responsibilities of that subrecipient and uses of those funds, or on the other side, non-allowable uses, unallowable uses. Is there anywhere you could point me that would basically, I know there's that 2 CRF 22, I believe, that outlines this and illustrates what are allowable and unallowable and some of the guidelines. But is there anything you could any direction you could point me in to kind of bullet point some of the things that they need to be cautious of?
And Kelly, maybe Brian, I hear you loud and clear. So Kelly and I wrote a couple blogs in what I'd call regular English, which basically is attempt to synthesize the federal guidance, the 2 CFR Part 200, all that detail into like, 2 pages of English narrative on the topic of subrecipients. How do you tell the difference between a subrecipient and a contractor? And now that you get a subrecipient, what are the things you need to do in terms of assessing their risk and then monitoring them? Kel, maybe you just share those blogs with
Yeah.
people like Brian and the rest.
Yeah, happy to, of
That would be great. Thank you.
course. And Brian, you're Hopkinton, is that right?
Correct. Yep, Town of Hopkinton.
Okay, great. Anyone else want to share what some of the kind of core challenges have been for you and your communities? Well, Jen has our contact info, so please reach out if we can ever help. And it's been a pleasure. Always happy to talk about these things with finance directors and town managers, and wish you the best. This is not an easy kind of scheme to administer. So hoping that the information we've provided today is useful, and wishing you the best with your journey.
Well, thank you all so much. I certainly will encourage both the folks on the call as well as those who weren't able to make it to reach out if they, have questions or are looking to engage someone to support them in these efforts, because, it's the kind of things we're hearing every day too at the league, is from the smallest communities that just don't even have the staff for these things. So if the ability to pay for someone to help them is already allowed in the money, I'm recommending it highly to them. So but again, thank you so much for your help today and your information, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Great. Nice to see you, Jen.
Thank you all.
Take
Thanks.
care.